Hello everybody, this is going to be the first video clip for the nervous system anatomy. And I'm going to try to, I know we're at the end of the semester, so I'm going to try to run through the nervous system anatomy as quickly and as painlessly as I can. I'll try not to be too long-winded. That's hard for me though. All right, so if you're, please be sure you have a copy of the Unit 5 Anatomy Nervous System Study Guide with you, and you probably also will want to have the labeling diagrams I've posted for you on Blackboard as we go through the nervous system anatomy. All right, so your nervous system is divided up into, if you're watching the physiology lectures, you already know that the nervous system is divided up into the central nervous system, and that consists of the brain and the spinal cord. And then you have your peripheral nervous system, and that consists of your spinal nerves and your cranial nerves that branch off of, well, the cranial nerves branch off of the brain and the brain stem. Spinal nerves branch off of the spinal cord, and then those nerves extend outward to all the various parts of the body. Most parts of the body are innervated. They're served by the peripheral nerves and their branches that perform the different functions that you're learning over on the physiology side. All right, so for this first video, we're going to cover brain anatomy. And so if you're following along with your anatomy study guide, I'm using Visible Body. You probably do want to use a 3D anatomy app to investigate the nervous system anatomy, because it's, you know, some things you can learn through diagrams pretty well, but then there are some brain anatomy features that are pretty difficult to learn without having something that you can play around with in 3D. And since I'm guessing most of you guys don't have brain models sitting at home in your living room, you probably want to try to use a 3D anatomy app to study the brain. Okay, the brain, if you'll notice in your study guide, it's divided up into 4 major regions, and those are called the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. And okay, the cerebrum, now here we're looking at a left lateral view of the brain, but I'll rotate it around, and all of this area here that I'm highlighting with the cursor, that's the cerebrum, so that's the main part of the brain, the bulk of the brain. All of that is cerebrum, the area with the big wrinkles in it. All right, and if we kind of look under here from an inferior view, you know, most of what you're seeing in here, all of this is part of the brain stem, and then the brain stem, of course, is going to connect down here to the spinal cord. So all of that's brain stem. Back here, you see this structure kind of looks like almost like a miniature brain with smaller wrinkles on it. And that is on the, this is the posterior side of the brain, this is the anterior side of the brain. And so this is actually called the cerebellum. That is a separate brain structure. And then that, that other part of the brain called the diencephalon, it is actually up in here, deeper in the brain, or if we're looking downward, the diencephalon is going to be down in here, deeper, beneath the deeper parts of the cerebrum, or just inferior to the cerebrum. And so we'll take a look at the diencephalon when we start dissecting into the brain here on Visible Body a little bit more closely. All right, let's cover the features of the cerebrum first. Now, first of all, the cerebrum, this is this part of the brain where you have the big wrinkles, and it's divided into a left side or a left hemisphere. So everything I'm kind of highlighting there with the cursor, and then over here, this is the right hemisphere of the brain. And there is a big division that's called the longitudinal fissure. We'll talk more about that in just a minute, but that's what divides the left side from the right side of the brain. And then the cerebrum is divided up into 4 major lobes, and those are your frontal lobe, which has a left, and I'm going to turn on multiple select here, and a right side. Now, a lot of times people just call this whole area the frontal lobe of the brain, and then other times people will say you have a left frontal lobe and a right frontal lobe, and you'll hear people refer to your frontal lobes in the plural sense. So don't get too stressed out over that. I mean, it's just some people call this whole thing the frontal lobe. People say this is the left frontal lobe, this is the right frontal lobe, and don't worry about left and right with the nervous system and anatomy structures that we're studying. All right, and so then posterior to the frontal lobe, you have the parietal lobe. So you've heard that before, parietal lobe, and actually this is included in the parietal lobe as well, and so is that. So all together, parietal lobe portion on the left, parietal lobe portion over there on the right. All right, and then you have your occipital lobe in the back, in that occipital area. Okay, and so you've got a left side of that, a left side of your occipital lobe. So we'll deselect those. So visible body is good for seeing the borders of these different lobes pretty easily. And then finally you have the temporal lobe on the left, and then you've got a temporal lobe over here on the right. Now those are obviously two separate lobes of the brain. So we really should say you have at least 5 major lobes of the brain: frontal, parietal, occipital, and then your left and your right temporal lobes. Okay, so those are pretty straightforward. All these wrinkles that you have in the cerebrum, the reason they're there, which I've mentioned over on the physiology side, is that increases the surface area of the cerebrum, and the cerebrum is where you have, the surface portion, the superficial portion of the cerebrum is where you have lots and lots and lots and lots of bodies of neurons that are important for all kinds of functions, including your consciousness, your logical thinking, sending out signals to control your muscles, interpreting information that comes in from your senses, your memory. All of those major functions are going on here in the cerebrum. You'll be learning about those over on the physiology side. So the wrinkling up here provides more surface area for cell bodies of neurons. If you didn't have these wrinkles in there, you wouldn't have, if the cerebrum was smooth, you wouldn't have as much surface area, and you wouldn't be able to have as many neuron cell bodies in that location. All right, so each of these hills or ridges that you see on the surface of the brain, each of those is called a gyrus, and gyri is the plural form of that. And then where you have the indentations, the valleys, each of those is called a sulcus. In some cases, more prominent ones are called fissures. For example, this heavy-duty sulcus you've got that's dividing up the left and the right hemispheres of the brain, that's called the longitudinal fissure because it runs in a longitudinal direction in between the two hemispheres of the brain. All right, then in your study guide, you've got some major fissures and sulci listed that you do need to be able to identify. So let's take a look at those. First one is that longitudinal fissure, and so that one's pretty straightforward. That's just that big major crack we have running down the center of the brain between the two hemispheres. That's going to be your longitudinal fissure. And it really does physically divide the brain. If you were actually dissecting a real brain, you'd be able to peel the two hemispheres apart and open up and look down at some of the deeper structures. The next one on your list, the central sulcus. The central sulcus is a fairly deep sulcus that divides the frontal lobe, and this is actually part of the frontal lobe right there, from the parietal lobe, which is back in here. So I'm not going to highlight the parietal lobe, but it's right in there. So there is a pretty deep sulcus that exists that runs right in between the frontal and the parietal lobe, and that is called the central sulcus. And over on the physiology side, you guys are going to learn that this gyrus right in here is called the precentral gyrus, and the neurons that are located in there control your skeletal muscles. They're sending signals down to the spinal cord and the brainstem, and telling the motor neurons that are there which skeletal muscle fibers need to be stimulated for muscle contractions. This gyrus, called the postcentral gyrus, deals with sensory information from particular parts of the body. And it's kind of neat how all those things are arranged. That'll be discussed, though, over on the physiology side. Now, you do have the central sulcus over on the right hemisphere as well, so it's not just on the left hemisphere, but I'm just showing it to you on this particular half. Oops, hang on, my little pen application here is lagging for me. All right, did it go away? All right, so if I rotate my brain around this way, we can highlight the frontal lobe over here on the right side. So right in there, you've got the central sulcus over here on that side as well. All right, the next one, let's deselect all of those. And let me highlight the temporal lobe over here on this side. And just above the temporal lobe, you've got a deep fissure right in there. And that is called your lateral sulcus or fissure. And it is over on the lateral side, sitting just above the temporal lobe. You have one of those on the left and one of those on the right. So that's pretty straightforward as well. And then the last major fissure that you need to be able to identify back here. So there's your occipital lobe, left and right side. Down here, this is your cerebellum. And so you've got a very deep indentation in between those two locations. And that is called your transverse fissure, right in through there, because that runs in a transverse direction underneath the occipital lobe and then on top of the cerebellum. All right, I'm actually going to conclude this first little video clip on the brain anatomy here, and I will cover the rest of the brain anatomy on the next video clip. I'm going to have to change some views here, so I'll stop this video and continue the brain anatomy on the next one.